The laughter hit Elowen Ashford like a closed fist. 300 guests in the gilded ballroom of Ravensmere Hall, crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across silk gowns and polished medals, and every single one of them was laughing at her. She stood at the centre of the marble dance floor in a dove-grey dress her mother had sewn by hand, her fingers trembling around a glass of water she could not bring herself to drink. Beside her, Lady Seraphina Voss leaned into Duke Caspian Thornwald's arm and whispered something that made his jaw tighten. Seraphina's emerald gown shimmered like a serpent's skin under the candlelight, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She had positioned herself precisely where every eye in the room could see her, her hand resting on Caspian's forearm with the easy possession of a woman who believed she had already won. The whispers rolled through the crowd like smoke. Poor creature. Did she really think a duke would choose her? She's nobody. A charity case dressed in borrowed lace. Illawen heard every word. She had spent 24 years learning to hear what people said when they thought no one important was listening. The evening had begun with a formal announcement. Duke Caspian Thornwald of Ravensmere, the most powerful landowner in the eastern counties, had invited the entire aristocracy to witness his selection of a bride. It was an ancient tradition, one that had not been observed in 3 generations, and society had descended upon the estate like vultures circling fresh prey. Every eligible woman of rank had arrived in her finest, their mothers and fathers calculating dowries and political alliances in hushed corridors. Illawen had not been invited. She was there because the Duchess Dowager, Caspian's grandmother, had personally requested her presence. Lady Ashford, the old woman, had written in her spidery hand, "Your daughter possesses qualities this household requires." Illawen's mother had wept when the letter arrived, not from joy, but from fear. The Ashford family had once been prosperous. Her father had been a respected magistrate before a fraudulent investment scheme orchestrated by Lord Aldrich Voss. Seraphina's father had destroyed their fortune and driven him to an early grave. They lived now in a draughty cottage at the edge of the county, surviving on Illawen's small income as a tutor and her mother's needlework. Illawen watched Seraphina guide Caspian through the crowd, her hand steering him like a ship's wheel, and she understood with absolute clarity what was happening. This was not a selection. This was a coronation. Seraphina had been grooming this moment for years, attending every function, flattering every ally, ensuring that when the Duke finally chose, there would be only one acceptable answer. The other women in attendance were decorations, present only to make the inevitable choice seem considered. And Elowen herself was something worse than a decoration. She was a joke. A poor girl from a ruined family, standing in a borrowed dress in a room full of people who had watched her father's destruction and done nothing. Seraphina had made certain everyone knew exactly who Elowen was, and exactly why her presence was laughable. The emerald-clad woman caught Elowen's eye across the room and smiled. It was the smile of a cat watching a mouse realize the door was locked. Illawen did not look away. She had learned long ago that looking away only told predators you were afraid. Instead, she held Seraphina's gaze with the steady patience of someone who had survived worse than laughter. The Duchess Dowager appeared at Illawen's elbow like a ghost in black silk. She was 83 years old, small as a sparrow, with eyes like polished obsidian that missed nothing. She carried an ivory cane she did not need and wore a single strand of pearls that were worth more than the Ashford cottage. "They are all watching the wrong woman," the Duchess Dowager said, her voice barely audible beneath the orchestra. Illawen glanced at her. "Your Grace, I believe I should leave." This was a mistake. "You have not yet made a mistake tonight, child." The old woman's fingers closed around Illawen's wrist with surprising strength. "The mistake would be leaving before my grandson sees what I see." "What do you see?" Illawen asked, her voice flat with exhaustion. "A woman who has been looking at this room for 2 hours and has already identified 3 discrepancies in the estate accounts displayed in the gallery," the old woman replied. Do not think I did not notice you studying those ledgers. Elawan felt heat rise in her cheeks. The framed accounts had been displayed as historical artifacts, but the numbers had bothered her. Columns that did not add up. Timber revenues that seemed impossibly low. Details no one was supposed to notice. The music stopped. A footman struck a silver bell 3 times, and the crowd parted like a sea of silk and broadcloth. Duke Caspian Thornwald stepped onto the raised platform at the far end of the ballroom, and Elowen saw him clearly for the first time that evening. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and eyes the colour of winter rain. His face was composed into the careful blankness of a man who had learned to hide everything behind duty, but Elowen caught something beneath it. A flicker of weariness. A heaviness in the set of his shoulders that had nothing to do with the weight of his formal coat. He looked like a man performing a role he had not chosen, and the loneliness of that performance was visible only if you knew where to look. Elawan knew where to look. She had been performing roles she had not chosen since she was 12 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, Caspian's voice carried across the ballroom with practiced authority. I thank you for attending this evening. The tradition of Ravensmere requires that I make my intentions known before this company. Seraphina stepped forward, her chin lifted, her smile radiant. The crowd held its breath. Caspian's eyes swept the room. They passed over Seraphina without stopping. They moved across the gathered faces, the expectant mothers, the calculating fathers, the women in their carefully chosen gowns. And then they found Elowen. She was standing near the back wall, half hidden behind a marble column, in her dove-grey dress with her mother's careful stitching, her dark hair pinned, simply, her face pale and composed. She was the least visible person in the room, and his gaze locked onto her as though she were the only one present. Miss Ashford, he said. The ballroom went silent. Not the polite silence of attention, but the stunned silence of 300 people who could not believe what they were hearing. Seraphina's smile froze on her face like cracked porcelain. Would you come forward? Caspian said. Elawan did not move. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain the people nearest to her could hear it. The Duchess Dowager's hand pressed firmly against the small of her back. Go, the old woman whispered. Elawan walked forward on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, the crowd parting before her in shocked silence. She reached the platform and looked up at the Duke of Ravensmere. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, pale grey with flecks of silver, and they held an expression she had not expected. Not the cold assessment of a man choosing a political asset. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. Before this company, Caspian said, his voice steady but low enough that the nearest guests had to lean forward, I declare my intention to offer marriage to Miss Elawan Ashford of the Ashford family. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sharp intake of breath from Seraphina Voss that sounded like tearing silk. Lady Voss surged forward, her composure shattered. This is absurd, she hissed, loud enough for half the room to hear. She is nobody. She has nothing. She is beneath this house. Caspian turned to look at Seraphina with an expression that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. And you, Lady Voss, he said quietly, have just demonstrated precisely why I did not choose you. Elowen stood on the platform, the eyes of 300 people burning into her skin, and felt the ground beneath her shift like an earthquake no one else could feel. She did not know what had just happened. She did not know why. But she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had survived loss and humiliation and silence, that her life had just changed forever. And not everyone in this room was going to forgive her for it. 3 years before the night that shattered every expectation in the eastern counties, Elawan Ashford knelt in the vegetable garden behind the cottage on Briersfield Lane and pulled weeds from soil so dry it crumbled between her fingers like ash. The sun hung low and copper-coloured over the village of Whitmore Cross, painting the crumbling stone walls in shades of amber that made the poverty almost beautiful. Almost. The cottage had been her grandmother's before the family's fall, a two-room dwelling with a leaking roof and windows that let in the November wind like uninvited guests. Eloan's mother, Mirren, sat inside at the kitchen table, stitching a commission for the dressmaker in town, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a woman who had learned to sew through tears. Eloan could hear the soft rhythm of the needle through the open door, steady as a heartbeat. And it was that sound, more than any other, that kept her tethered to the earth on the days when grief threatened to pull her under. Her father had been dead for 2 years. The grave sat on a hill above the village, marked with a simple stone because they could not afford anything more, and Eloan visited it every Sunday morning before the church bells rang. The destruction of the Ashford family had been surgical and deliberate. Eloan's father, Magistrate Edmund Ashford, had been investigating irregularities in the county's land records when he discovered that Lord Aldrich Voss had been systematically defrauding tenant farmers through forged ownership documents. Before Edmund could present his findings, Voss had moved first. A fraudulent investment scheme bearing Edmund's name appeared in the county register. Witnesses materialized to testify they had seen him soliciting funds. By the time the truth might have been uncovered, Edmund's reputation was destroyed, his assets seized, and his family cast out of the society that had once respected them. Edmund Ashford died of a heart attack 6 months later, sitting in the chair by the cottage fire, holding the last letter he had written to the county court requesting a review of his case. The letter was never delivered. Eloan had found him in the morning, the paper still clutched in his cold fingers, and she had sat beside him for an hour before she could bring herself to call for help. She was 21 years old. She did not cry at his funeral. She had already used up every tear she had. In the months that followed, Eloan discovered a talent she had not known she possessed. She could see patterns in numbers the way some people saw patterns in fabric or music. The account books her father had kept, meticulous records of every transaction in the county, became her obsession. She studied them at night by candlelight, tracing the threads of Aldrich Voss's corruption through columns of figures and dates and signatures. She could not prove anything yet. The evidence her father had gathered was gone, seized along with everything else. But the numbers told their own story if you knew how to listen, and Eloan was learning to listen with the patience of a woman who understood that justice moved slowly but arrived eventually. During the day, she taught reading and arithmetic to the children of farmers and tradespeople who could not afford the parish school. She charged what they could pay, which was sometimes nothing at all, and she walked 3 miles each way to the village hall where she held her lessons. The children loved her. They did not know she was the disgraced magistrate's daughter. They knew only that Miss Ashford explained fractions using apple slices and never raised her voice when they made mistakes. It was during one of these walks that Eloan first encountered the Duchess Dowager of Ravensmere. The old woman's carriage had thrown a wheel on the narrow road between Whitmore Cross and the Ravensmere estate, and her driver was struggling with the repair when Eloan came around. The bend. The Duchess Dowager sat on a fallen log beside the road, her black silk dress incongruous against the muddy backdrop, her expression one of patient irritation. Eloan stopped. "Your Grace, may I offer assistance?" The old woman studied her with those obsidian eyes. "You are Edmund Ashford's daughter." Eloan felt the familiar sting of recognition, the way her father's name still carried the weight of scandal even 2 years after his death. "I am," she said, keeping her voice level. The Duchess Dowager nodded. "Your father came to see me once before his troubles. He wanted to discuss certain irregularities in the county records." Eloan's heart lurched. "You knew about the investigation?" "I knew your father was an honest man," the old woman said simply, "and I know that honest men rarely destroy themselves." She paused, her gaze sharpening. "You have his eyes. The same way of looking at things as though you're reading a ledger no one else can see." That roadside meeting became the first of many. The Duchess Dowager invited Elowen to tea at Ravensmere Hall once a week, ostensibly to discuss the estate's charitable works, but in reality to study the young woman with the quiet intensity of a jeweller examining an uncut diamond. Elowen discovered that the Duchess Dowager was sharp, unsentimental, and deeply unhappy with the direction of her grandson's life. Caspian had inherited the dukedom at 22 when his parents died in a carriage accident, and the weight of it had turned a warm-hearted young man into a fortress of duty and distance. He trusts no one, the old woman told Elowen one rainy afternoon. He has been surrounded by people who want something from him since the day he inherited. Seraphina Voss, Lady Pemberton's daughters, the Marquis of Holloway's niece. They see the title, the estates, the power. Not one of them has ever asked him what he reads or what makes him laugh or what he dreams about when the house is quiet. Elowen said nothing. She understood the loneliness of being seen only for what you lacked. She imagined it was equally lonely to be seen only for what you possessed. The Duchess Dowager set down her teacup with a decisive click. I need someone in this house who sees clearly, someone who cannot be bought or flattered or frightened. Elowen held the old woman's gaze. What exactly are you asking me? I am asking you to accept an invitation to the Ravensmere Selection Ball, the Duchess Dowager said, and I am asking you to be exactly who you are when you arrive. Elowen stared at her. Your Grace, I have no gown, no connections, no dowry. The entire county believes my father was a criminal. Seraphina Voss will destroy me on sight. The old woman smiled, and for a moment Elowen caught a glimpse of the formidable woman she must have been in her youth. Seraphina Voss has been destroying things her entire life. She destroyed your father because he threatened her father's schemes. She will try to destroy you because you threaten her ambitions. The question is whether you will let her. Elowen thought of her father's grave on the hill. She thought of the letter he never sent, the justice he never received, the truth that was still buried under layers of lies and forged documents. She thought of her mother's fingers moving endlessly over needle and thread, sewing someone else's dreams, while her own gathered dust. No, Elowen said, I will not let her. The Duchess Dowager's smile widened. Then we have work to do. Your mother's needlework is exceptional. Let us see what she can accomplish with proper fabric. Something in dove grey, I think. Grey is the colour of steel when you look at it in the right light. In the weeks before the ball, Elowen studied the Ravensmere estate records that the Duchess Dowager made available to her. She discovered what she had suspected from the framed accounts in the gallery, that someone had been systematically skimming revenues from the estate's timber holdings and tenant rents for at least 5 years. The amounts were small enough to escape casual notice, but large enough over time to represent a significant theft. She also discovered that the primary beneficiary of several questionable transactions was a holding company whose registered address matched a property owned by the Voss family. The connection between the Voss family and the corruption at Ravensmere ran deeper than anyone knew. Elowen documented everything in a small leather notebook she kept hidden in the lining of her coat. She told no one, not even the Duchess Dowager. She had learned from her father's fate that revealing evidence too early was as dangerous as having no evidence at all. The night before the ball, she sat at the cottage window and looked at the stars above Whitmore Cross and made herself a promise. She would walk into Ravensmere Hall, and she would not be invisible. Not because she would demand attention, but because she would carry the truth with her, and the truth, sooner or later, always made itself seen. Seraphina Voss had known she would be Duchess of Ravensmere since she was 16 years old. Her father, Lord Aldrich Voss, had told her so on the evening of her first society ball, straightening the pearls at her throat while her mother adjusted the hem of her white debut gown. The Thornwald boy will inherit within a decade, Aldrich had said, his voice carrying the casual certainty of a man who arranged outcomes the way other men arranged furniture. When he does, you will be there. You will be indispensable. And when he needs a wife, you will be the only rational choice. Serafina had accepted this destiny with the same cool pragmatism she brought to everything. She was beautiful, intelligent, and entirely without illusions about the nature of power. Love was a fairy tale told to girls who lacked ambition. Marriage was architecture, and she intended to build an empire. For 8 years, she had executed her father's strategy with surgical precision, attending every function where Caspian appeared, cultivating friendships with his allies, studying his habits and preferences until she knew him better than anyone alive. She knew he preferred coffee to tea. She knew he read philosophy before bed. She knew the sound of his laugh, rare as it was, and exactly which topics could coax it from him. What Serafina had not anticipated was the Duchess Dowager's interference. The old woman had always been polite to her, but never warm, and Serafina had dismissed her as a relic of a previous generation, too old and too removed from power to matter. That had been a miscalculation. When word reached her that the Duchess Dowager had personally invited Edmund Ashford's daughter to the selection ball, Serafina's composure cracked for the first time in years. She stood in her father's study, the letter of invitation confirmed by 3 separate sources, and felt something she had not felt since childhood. Fear. Not of Elawan herself. The girl was nobody, a penniless tutor in a borrowed dress. But Serafina understood power dynamics the way a chess master understands the board, and the Duchess Dowager did not make moves without reason. If the old woman had chosen Eloan Ashford, there was something about the girl that Serafina could not yet see, and invisible threats were the most dangerous kind. "Father," she said, turning to Aldrich, who sat behind his desk, surrounded by documents and brandy, "we have a problem." Aldrich Voss looked up with the mild irritation of a man disturbed during important work. "The Ashford girl is nothing," Aldrich said, waving his hand dismissively. "Her father was a fool who overreached, and she has inherited his irrelevance." But Serafina shook her head, pacing the length of the study with the restless energy of a caged animal. The Duchess Dowager chose her specifically. Why? What does that old woman see? Aldrich leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with calculating eyes. Perhaps she sees a charity case, a way to make her grandson feel virtuous by offering crumbs to the poor. Serafina stopped pacing. No, the Duchess Dowager does not deal in sentiment. She deals in strategy. If she brought the Ashford girl into Ravensmere, it is because the Ashford girl serves a purpose we have not identified. She turned to face her father directly. "What did Edmund Ashford know before you destroyed him?" Aldrich's expression shifted, the mild irritation replaced by something harder and more guarded. "That matter is closed," he said firmly. "The man is dead. His findings died with him." "Are you certain?" Serafina's voice was quiet, but edged with steel. "Because if his daughter has inherited even a fraction of his investigative talent, and the Duchess Dowager has given her access to Ravensmere's records, we may have resurrected the very threat we thought we buried." The silence in the study stretched like a wire pulled taut. Aldrich Voss set down his brandy glass with deliberate care and looked at his daughter with an expression she had never seen before. It was not anger. It was reassessment, the look of a man realizing his opponent had made a move he had not predicted. "Very well," he said finally. "If the girl is a threat, we will manage her. I did not spend 15 years building our position in this county to have it undone by a dead man's daughter with a head for numbers." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the immaculate Voss gardens, every hedge trimmed to mathematical precision. "The arrangement with Ravensmere's steward remains secure," he said, almost to himself. "Hargrove has been skimming the estate accounts for 5 years under our direction. Even if the girl suspects something, she cannot prove it without access to the original documents, and those are locked in my private vault." Serafina joined him at the window. And if the Duchess Dowager gives her that access, then we accelerate, Aldrich said. The selection ball provides the perfect opportunity. If Caspian chooses you, the Ashford girl becomes irrelevant overnight. And if he does not? Serafina asked. Aldrich turned to his daughter with a smile that held no warmth. He will choose you, he said, because I have ensured there is no alternative. Every family of standing has been reminded of the advantages of a Voss alliance. Every potential rival has been discouraged through the usual channels. The Ashford girl has no supporters, no resources, and no reputation. Even the Duchess Dowager's patronage cannot overcome the stain of her father's disgrace. Serafina wanted to believe him. She had spent 8 years wanting to believe that the future was as controlled and predictable as her father promised. But something nagged at her, a whisper of doubt that had taken root when she first heard Eloan Ashford's name and had been growing ever since. She remembered seeing the girl once, 3 years ago, at the village market in Whitmore Cross. Eloan had been buying flour, counting coins from a worn leather purse, with the careful precision of someone for whom every penny mattered. What had struck Serafina was not the girl's poverty, but her composure. There was no self-pity in her bearing, no bitterness in her expression. She had moved through the market with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew exactly who she was, and had made peace with the cost of that knowledge. It was the composure of someone who had already lost everything and discovered she could survive it. On the night of the ball, Serafina arrived at Ravensmere Hall in the emerald gown she had commissioned from London's finest dressmaker. It was a weapon as much as a garment, designed to catch every eye and hold every breath. She swept through the entrance with the practiced confidence of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, her smile perfect, her posture regal, her hand finding Caspian's arm with the ease of long familiarity. He acknowledged her with the distant courtesy he showed everyone, which should have warned her, but did not. She was too focused on the performance to notice the signs. She did not see the way his eyes moved past her when he scanned the room. She did not notice the Duchess Dowager positioned near the back wall, watching the crowd with the predatory stillness of a hawk. And she did not see Eloan Ashford standing in the shadows, her dove-grey dress almost invisible against the marble columns, her dark eyes taking in everything with the quiet intensity of a woman who had been studying the room's secrets for months. By the time Serafina noticed Eloan, it was too late. The silver bell had already rung 3 times. What happened next would become the most discussed moment in the county's social history. When Caspian spoke Eloan's name instead of hers, Serafina felt the world tilt beneath her feet like a ship caught in a sudden storm. She heard the gasps, felt the eyes of 300 people turning toward her to witness her humiliation, and for one terrible moment, the mask she had worn for 8 years slipped completely. Rage, pure, white-hot, consuming rage flooded through her, and it took every ounce of her training to prevent it from reaching her face. She turned on her heel and left the ballroom, her emerald skirts cutting through the crowd like the wake of a departing vessel. In the carriage, she sat in absolute darkness and allowed herself 30 seconds of fury. She pressed her fists against her eyes until she saw stars, and then she stopped. She smoothed her skirts. She adjusted her gloves. She breathed. And then she began to plan, because Serafina Voss did not accept defeat. She rearranged the terms of the contest. The Ashford girl had won the battle, but the war was only beginning, and Serafina had weapons the girl could not imagine. By morning, the first letter was dispatched. By noon, the first alliance was secured. By evening, the trap was set. The morning after the selection ball, Eloan woke in a bedroom at Ravensmere Hall that was larger than the entire cottage on Briarsfield Lane. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, falling across a four-poster bed hung with ivory damask and a carpet so thick her feet disappeared into it when she stood. For a long moment she did not move, suspended in the disorienting space between the life she had lived yesterday and the life that had been offered to her last night. The air smelled of lavender and beeswax and old money, a scent so foreign to her experience that it made her throat tight with something she could not name. Her mother's dress hung on the wardrobe door, dove grey and carefully pressed, and the sight of those hand-stitched seams in this room of impossible luxury broke something open in Eloan's chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her face and breathed until the feeling passed. She was not going to cry. Crying was a luxury she could not yet afford because nothing had been decided. A declaration of intention was not a marriage, and the distance between this morning and a wedding ring was filled with people who wanted her to fail. Caspian Thornwald found her in the library 2 hours later. She had dressed in a plain morning gown the housekeeper had provided and gone immediately to the one room in the house where she felt most herself, surrounded by books and ledgers and the quiet comfort of organized information. He entered without announcement, closing the door behind him with the decisive click of a man who had something to say and did not wish to be interrupted while saying it. "Miss Ashford," he began, and then stopped, as though the formality of the address tasted wrong in his mouth. "Elowan." She looked up from the volume of county records she had been studying and met his gaze. Up close, without the chandeliers and the crowd and the weight of 300 watching eyes, he looked younger than he had the night before. The weariness was still there, but something else had joined it, a tentative openness that she suspected he showed to very few people. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do," she agreed, her voice calm and steady. She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "But first, may I ask you something?" He sat, his long frame folding into the leather armchair, with the careful tension of a man who did not relax easily. "Ask." "Why me?" she said. The same question every person in that ballroom was asking last night. "You do not know me. We have never spoken before. I am the daughter of a man this county believes to be a criminal, and I own nothing but a cottage, with a leaking roof, and a leather notebook full of numbers." Caspian studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes measuring her with an intensity that might have been unsettling if she had not been accustomed to being studied and found wanting. "My grandmother has spoken of you for months," he said finally. "She told me about a young woman who noticed discrepancies in the estate accounts from across a gallery, who teaches children for free because she believes education is a right, not a privilege, who visits her father's grave every Sunday and walks 3 miles in the rain to do it." He paused. "But that is not why I chose you." Elowan waited. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and for a moment the Duke disappeared entirely, and she was looking at a man who was simply tired of pretending. "I chose you because when Serafina Voss positioned herself at my arm last night and the entire room assumed the outcome was decided, you were the only person who did not look at me with expectation. You looked at me with understanding." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people recognizing something in each other that did not require words to explain. Elowan understood what he meant because she had felt it herself, the exhaustion of being seen only through the lens of other people's assumptions. She had been the disgraced magistrate's daughter for so long that she had almost forgotten she was anything else. And Caspian had been the Duke for so long that no one remembered to ask who he was underneath the title. "I must be honest with you," Caspian said, and the shift in his tone told her the next words would cost him something. "I am not offering love. I do not know if I am capable of it any more. There was a woman before you, before the inheritance, Lady Eleanor Whitmore. Our families arranged a match, and I believed it was genuine. She left me for a wealthier prospect 3 weeks before the wedding, and I discovered afterward that our entire courtship had been orchestrated by her mother as a negotiating strategy to drive up the dowry from a rival suitor." Elawan absorbed this without reaction. She had suspected something like this from the Duchess Dowager's hints about her grandson's past. Since Eleanor, Caspian continued, his voice dropping to the low register of a man confessing something he had never spoken aloud, I have operated on the assumption that every relationship is a transaction. Every smile has a price. Every kindness has a condition. I built walls because walls kept people out, and keeping people out kept me safe. He looked at her directly. I chose you because my grandmother believes you are honest, and I need honesty more than I need affection. I need a partner who will tell me the truth, even when it is difficult. I need someone who sees the estate as more than a source of wealth and the tenants as more than numbers on a page. Elawan considered his words with the same careful attention she gave to columns of figures. You are offering a partnership, she said, not a romance. He nodded. I am offering respect, security, and a position of genuine authority within this household. What I cannot offer, at least not yet, is my heart. The honesty was brutal and refreshing in equal measure. Elawan had spent 3 years in a world where everyone lied, and here was a man telling her exactly what he could and could not give. Then I accept your terms, Elawan said, with one addition. Caspian raised an eyebrow. I want full access to the estate's financial records. All of them, past and present. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to identify. Why? Because your estate is being robbed, she said simply. I noticed it in the gallery accounts last night, and I suspected it before that from conversations with your grandmother. Someone has been skimming revenues from your timber holdings and manipulating tenant rents for at least 5 years. The sums are small individually, but significant in aggregate. Caspian went very still. He stared at her for a long moment, and she watched the implications of what she had said work their way through his expression. You noticed this? From framed accounts displayed as decorations, he said flatly. She held his gaze. My father trained me to read numbers the way other people read faces. I see what the figures are trying to hide, for the first time since he had entered the library. Something shifted in Caspian's bearing. The careful distance he maintained with everyone, the walls he had described, developed a crack so fine it was barely visible. But Elawan saw it. She saw everything. You will have full access, he said quietly, to every document, every ledger, every record this estate possesses. And if you find what you suspect, you will bring it to me before anyone else. Agreed, Elawan said. One more thing, Caspian added, and his voice carried an edge that had not been there before. Seraphina Voss will not accept last night gracefully. Her father is powerful and vindictive, and they have allies throughout the county. You should know that by choosing you, I have made enemies of people who are accustomed to getting what they want. Elawan thought of her father's grave. She thought of the forged documents and the stolen fortune and the letter that was never delivered. She thought of her mother's worn fingers and the children she taught for pennies and the years of silence and survival that had brought her to this moment. I am already acquainted with the Voss family's methods, she said, and her voice was steady as stone. They destroyed my father because he found the truth. I intend to finish what he started. Caspian looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, a ghost of something that might have been admiration passed across his features. Then, Miss Ashford, he said, I believe we have an arrangement. The crack in his walls widened by a fraction, and Elawan stepped through it. The wedding was held 3 weeks later in the Ravensmere Chapel, a small stone building older than the estate itself, with stained glass windows that threw patterns of blue and gold across the worn flagstones. Elawan wore a simple ivory gown her mother had spent every waking hour creating, each stitch a prayer, each seam a small act of love made tangible in fabric and thread. Mirren Ashford sat in the front pew and wept silently through the entire ceremony, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her late husband's initials. The Duchess Dowager sat beside her, rigid and composed, but Elowin caught the old woman's hand squeeze Mirren's at the moment the vows were spoken. The ceremony was small by ducal standards. Caspian had insisted on it, refusing the grand spectacle that tradition demanded, and the guest list included only those whose presence was required by law or genuine affection. Serafina Voss was not among them. Neither was her father. The absence of the county's most powerful family was noted by everyone and discussed by no one, at least not within earshot of the bride and groom. Caspian spoke his vows with the same careful precision he brought to everything, his voice steady, his expression composed. He did not smile, but when he placed the ring on Elowin's finger, his hand lingered on hers for a moment longer than protocol required, and she felt the warmth of it like a question. The first months of marriage established a pattern that would have seemed strange to anyone who did not understand its logic. Caspian and Elowin operated as parallel forces within Ravensmere Hall, their orbits intersecting at formal meals and estate business, but rarely overlapping in the intimate spaces where a marriage usually took root. He gave her the East Wing study as her office, a room with tall windows overlooking the gardens and a desk large enough to hold the mountains of ledgers she accumulated. She spent hours there each day, working through years of financial records with the methodical patience of an archaeologist excavating a buried city. What she found confirmed her suspicions and exceeded them. The estate steward, Mr. Hargrove, had been operating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme in partnership with Lord Aldrich Voss. Timber revenues were being diverted through shell companies. Tenant rents were artificially inflated, with the excess skimmed before reaching the estate's central accounts. Maintenance costs were padded with phantom invoices from suppliers who did not exist. The total amount stolen over 5 years exceeded £12,000, a fortune that had been bled from Ravensmere drop by drop, while Caspian, buried in grief and duty, had trusted the wrong people. Elowin documented everything with the precision her father had taught her, cross-referencing entries, identifying patterns, building a case that no magistrate could dismiss. She worked in silence, telling no one except Caspian, who received her weekly reports with the grim focus of a man discovering that the foundations of his house had been eaten away while he slept. Their conversations during these meetings were formal and factual. Two partners reviewing evidence rather than a husband and wife sharing a life. But Elowin noticed things. She noticed that Caspian began arriving at her study earlier each week, staying longer, asking questions that went beyond the numbers. She noticed that he brought coffee without being asked, prepared the way she liked it, dark with a single spoonful of honey. She noticed that when she explained a particularly complex financial maneuver, his eyes held an expression that was not quite admiration, but lived in the same neighborhood. And she noticed that he never dismissed her findings, never questioned her competence, never suggested that perhaps a man should review her work. He simply listened, absorbed, and acted. Meanwhile, Serafina Voss was not idle. 3 weeks after the wedding, whispers began circulating through the county's drawing rooms, like smoke through a cracked chimney. The new Duchess, they said, was unstable, obsessed with numbers and records, spending hours locked away in her study instead of fulfilling her social duties. The household staff found her strange, distant, cold. She had been seen arguing with the steward, overstepping her authority, meddling in affairs that were not her concern. The whispers were precise, coordinated, and devastating. They reached Elowin through the sympathetic housekeeper, Mrs. Baines, who delivered them with the apologetic discomfort of a woman who knew the difference between gossip and strategy. "They are saying you are unfit, Your Grace," Mrs. Baines said, wringing her hands in the doorway of Elowin's study, "that the Duke made a terrible mistake and is too proud to admit it." Elowin set down her pen and looked at the housekeeper with an air expression that held no surprise and no distress. "Let them say it," she replied quietly. "Words are only dangerous when they are true." But the words did damage because words always do when they are repeated often enough by people who want them to be true. Invitations to social events dried up. The county families who might have welcomed the new Duchess kept their distance, unwilling to align themselves with a woman the Voss family had declared unacceptable. At church on Sundays, Elowan sat in the Ravensmere pew and felt the turned backs and averted eyes like physical blows, each one a reminder that she was still the disgraced magistrate's daughter, no matter what title she wore. Caspian observed this isolation with a gathering storm behind his eyes that Elowan found herself unable to read. He said nothing about it directly. He was, she was learning, a man who processed things internally, building responses the way other men built bridges, with careful engineering and hidden supports. But she noticed that he began appearing at her side during the few public occasions they attended together, his hand at the small of her back, his presence a silent declaration that the whispers had been heard and would not go unanswered. The first time he did it, at a harvest festival where the other families had pointedly ignored her, Elowan looked up at him with a question in her eyes. He met her gaze with the steady certainty of a man who had made a decision. "You are my wife," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "Anyone who insults you insults Ravensmere, and I protect what is mine." The words sent something warm and complicated through her chest, and she spent the rest of the evening trying to untangle whether the warmth came from the protection or from the way he had said mine. Not possessive. Protective. The distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. That night, long after the household had retired, Elowan sat in her study reviewing the latest batch of ledgers, and heard a knock at her door. It was after midnight, and the hallway beyond was dark, except for a single candle Caspian carried. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his hair disordered, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen during daylight hours. "I cannot sleep," he said simply. The admission cost him something. She could see the effort of vulnerability in the set of his jaw, the way his hand tightened around the candlestick. "Neither can I," she said. He looked at the scattered ledgers covering her desk, and something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Show me what you have found," he said, and pulled a chair beside hers. They sat together in the candlelight, shoulders nearly touching, as she walked him through the tangled web of Hargrove's embezzlement and the Voss family's involvement. She showed him how the numbers connected, how each small theft linked to the next in a chain that led directly to Aldrich Voss's door. Caspian listened with fierce concentration, asking questions that proved he understood not just the mathematics, but the human cruelty behind them. These families, he said, staring at a column of inflated rents that had forced 3 tenant households into poverty. "These are my people. I was supposed to protect them." "You did not know," Elowan said gently. He shook his head. "I should have known. I buried myself in duty and let the details fall to men I never bothered to question." His voice carried a self-recrimination so sharp it cut the air between them. "Your father tried to tell someone. My grandmother tried to tell me. And I was too wrapped in my own walls to listen." He looked at her, and in the candlelight his grey eyes held something raw and undefended. "I am listening now." It was not a declaration of love. It was something older and perhaps more durable than that. It was the sound of a wall coming down, stone by stone, in the quiet dark. The attack came on a Tuesday in November, 6 months after the wedding, when the first frost painted the Ravensmere grounds in crystal and silver. Elowan was in the village of Whitmore Cross, visiting the widow of a tenant farmer who had died the previous winter, when she saw the carriage. It was black and unmarked, moving through the village with the slow deliberation of a predator, and it stopped directly in front of the magistrate's office. 2 men in dark coats emerged, carrying a leather portfolio, and disappeared inside. Elowan watched from the widow's doorway, with the prickling awareness of someone who recognized the shape of danger even before it revealed itself. She had seen those men before. They were solicitors from the firm that handled the Voss family's legal affairs. By the time she returned to Ravensmere Hall, the damage was already in motion. Caspian met her in the entrance hall with an expression that made her stomach drop. His face was controlled, the ducal mask firmly in place, but his eyes were burning with barely contained fury. He held a document in his hand. "The county magistrate," he said, his voice clipped and precise, "has received a formal petition claiming that the Duchess of Ravensmere, formerly Miss Eloan Ashford, is party to an ongoing fraud originally perpetrated by her father, Magistrate Edmund Ashford." The petition was a masterwork of legal destruction. It alleged that Edmund Ashford's fraudulent investment scheme had not been a solo operation but a family enterprise, with Eloan serving as her father's accomplice in forging documents and concealing stolen funds. It further alleged that her marriage to the Duke had been engineered to gain access to the Ravensmere estate's financial records in order to continue the scheme from a position of greater power. The evidence presented was fabricated with expert precision, including forged letters purportedly in Eloan's handwriting, false testimony from a servant who claimed to have witnessed her copying financial documents for sale to competitors, and a manufactured paper trail suggesting that the Ashford family had hidden assets in a foreign bank account. Every element of the petition was designed to accomplish two things simultaneously. First, to destroy Eloan's credibility before she could present her own evidence of the Voss family's corruption. Second, to force Caspian into an impossible choice between his wife and his reputation, a choice that Serafina believed would end with Eloan's removal from Ravensmere and Caspian's dependence on the Voss family's political support. Eloan read the petition in her study with hands that trembled not from fear, but from rage. She recognized her father's destruction being replayed in new form, the same tactics, the same manufactured evidence, the same assumption that the truth could be buried under enough paper and enough powerful signatures. They had forged her handwriting well enough to fool a casual observer, but Eloan caught the errors immediately. The forger had used her current writing style, not the girlish hand she would have written in at the age the letters were supposedly composed. The servant who testified against her had been dismissed from Ravensmere 3 years before Eloan ever set foot in the house, a fact easily verified from the household records. And the foreign bank account cited in the petition was registered at a bank that had not existed until 2 years after her father's death. The fabrication was clever but imperfect, constructed in haste by people who had underestimated her ability to fight back. But Eloan knew from her father's experience that truth alone was not enough. The Voss family had the magistrate's ear, the county's sympathy, and 8 years of carefully cultivated alliances. She needed more. She needed proof, not just of her own innocence, but of the Voss family's guilt, and she needed it before the magistrates, hearing in 3 weeks. Caspian found her still at her desk at 2 in the morning, surrounded by documents, her eyes red-rimmed, but her expression fierce. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and then he did something that shattered every remaining assumption she held about the man she had married. He sat down beside her, removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "Tell me where to start." She looked at him. "You believe me," she said. It was not a question, but it needed to be spoken aloud. He met her gaze with absolute steadiness. "I have watched you work for 6 months," he said. "I have seen your integrity in every line of every ledger you have touched. I do not need to believe you because I know you, Eloan, and I know that the woman who visits her father's grave every Sunday in the rain is not capable of dishonoring his memory by committing the crimes he was falsely accused of." The words landed in the center of Eloan's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through parts of her she had thought were frozen solid. No one had ever said they knew her. Not like that. Not with the quiet certainty of a man who had been paying attention not because it was required, but because he wanted to. She blinked hard, twice, and then she nodded and spread the documents between them. They worked through the night and into the dawn, piecing together the counter-evidence with the collaborative intensity of two minds that had found, against all expectation, a perfect, complementary rhythm. Caspian's strength was strategic. He understood political networks, knew which alliances were genuine and which were transactional, and could predict how the county's power brokers would respond to each piece of evidence. Ilawan's strength was analytical. She could trace a financial thread through 10 years of records and emerge with a narrative that was irrefutable. Together, they built a case not just against the petition but against the entire architecture of corruption that the Voss family had constructed over 15 years. As dawn broke over Ravensmere, turning the frost on the gardens to diamonds, Caspian set down the last document and looked at Eloan across the desk. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes held something she had not seen there before. It was not the careful distance of their arrangement. It was not the measured respect of a business partnership. It was something warmer and more vulnerable than either of those things. And it terrified her, because she recognized it. She had been carrying the same feeling in her own chest for weeks, pressed down beneath duty and caution and the absolute conviction that allowing herself to feel anything for Caspian Thornwald was a luxury as dangerous as it was tempting. "Your father would be proud of you," Caspian said quietly. Ilawan's vision blurred. She turned away quickly, pressing her hand against her mouth, and for one long moment the study was silent, except for the distant singing of birds in the frost-covered gardens. When she turned back, her eyes were dry, and her voice was steady. "He would want me to finish it," she said. "So let us finish it." Caspian nodded once, and in that nod Ilawan saw something she had stopped daring to hope for. Not just an alliance, not just a partnership. The first tentative foundation of something that felt, against all probability, like home. But the Voss family was not finished. The following week, Ilawan received a visitor she had not expected. Serafina Voss arrived at Ravensmere Hall unannounced, wearing riding clothes and carrying a smile that held all the warmth of a January midnight. She was shown to the drawing room, where Ilawan received her with the composed courtesy that had become her armour. "You look well," Serafina said, settling into a chair with the ease of someone who had once expected to own it. "Marriage agrees with you." Ilawan poured tea with steady hands. "What do you want, Lady Voss?" Serafina's smile sharpened. "I want to offer you a way out. Withdraw your investigation into the estate accounts, persuade your husband to drop the counter-petition, and I will ensure the charges against you are dismissed quietly, with no public scandal." Ilawan set down the teapot and looked at Serafina with an expression that made the other woman's smile falter. "You are offering me the same bargain your father offered." "Mine," she said. Silence in exchange for survival. "The difference is that my father accepted it, and it killed him." She stood. "I will not make his mistake." Serafina's composure cracked just for an instant. "You cannot win this," she hissed. "You are one woman against an entire county." Elowen walked to the door and opened it. "I am the Duchess of Ravensmere," she said, "and I am not alone. Now leave my house." The hearing was set for the first week of December in the county courthouse in the town of Aldermere, a grey stone building that smelled of damp wood and centuries of adjudicated grievances. Ilawan spent the days before it in a state of focused calm that masked a terror so deep it lived in her bones. She had been here before, not in this courthouse, not facing these specific accusations, but standing at the edge of a legal proceeding that had the power to destroy everything she loved. Her father had stood in a room like this and lost everything, and the ghost of that loss walked beside her as she prepared her defense. The difference, she told herself, was evidence. Her father had been ambushed, his findings seized before he could present them. Ilawan had spent 6 months building a case so thorough, so meticulously documented, that no amount of political influence could dismiss it. She had copies of every ledger, every forged invoice, every fraudulent transaction. She had testimony from tenant farmers who had been overcharged. She had correspondence between Hargrove and Aldrich Voss that she had discovered hidden in a false bottom of the steward's desk. Letters that described the embezzlement scheme in Voss's own handwriting. And she had one piece of evidence that changed everything. The Duchess Dowager had given it to her 3 days before the hearing. The old woman had summoned Elowen to her private chambers on the top floor of Ravensmere Hall, a room Elowen had never entered, and produced a sealed envelope from a locked drawer in her writing desk. "Your father left this with me," the Duchess Dowager said, 2 weeks before his troubles began. "He asked me to keep it safe and deliver it to the right person at the right time." She pressed the envelope into Elowen's hands. "I have waited 3 years for the right person." Elowen opened the envelope with shaking fingers and found inside a complete copy of her father's original investigation, every document, every ledger entry, every piece of evidence he had gathered against Aldrich Voss before the walls closed in. He had known. Her father had known the danger was coming, and had ensured that the truth would survive, even if he did not. The realization hit her like a wave, staggering in its implications, and for the first time since his funeral, Elowen wept. She wept for the father who had loved her enough to plan for the possibility of his own destruction. She wept for the years of silence and poverty and determination. And she wept because she was about to do exactly what he had hoped. She would do. The morning of the hearing, Caspian walked Elowen to the carriage in the grey December light. He was dressed formally, his expression the controlled mask he wore in public, but as he helped her into the carriage, his hand caught hers and held it. He did not speak. He simply looked at her with those winter grey eyes, and in them she saw something that transcended the careful boundaries of their arrangement. It was not a declaration. It was a promise, wordless and fierce and absolute, that whatever happened in that courthouse, she would not face it alone. She squeezed his hand once and let go. The courtroom was packed. Every family of note in the county had turned out to witness the proceedings, their faces arranged in expressions of studied neutrality that concealed various degrees of anticipation, sympathy, and barely disguised hunger for scandal. Seraphina Voss sat in the front row, immaculate in dark blue, her expression serene. Aldrich Voss sat beside her, his bearing radiating the confidence of a man who believed the outcome had been arranged. The magistrate, Sir Howard Crane, was a cautious man who understood which way the political winds blew, and Aldrich Voss controlled most of the wind in this county. The Voss family's solicitor presented the petition with the practiced eloquence of a man accustomed to winning. He laid out the forged evidence, the manufactured testimony, the false paper trail, each element delivered with the grave solemnity of someone discussing matters of genuine concern rather than constructed lies. When he finished, the courtroom murmured with exactly the blend of shock and righteous indignation that had been intended. Sir Howard turned to Elowen. "The Duchess of Ravensmere may respond." Elowen stood. She was wearing the dove-grey dress her mother had made for the selection ball, a deliberate choice that carried its own message. She was not performing power. She was performing truth, and truth did not need emerald silk to make itself heard. She spoke clearly, without notes, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. She began not with the petition against her, but with a story. 3 years ago, she said, a man named Edmund Ashford discovered that the county's land records had been systematically falsified. He brought his findings to the authorities. Before he could present them, his reputation was destroyed, his family was ruined, and he died holding a letter that was never delivered. The courtroom went very still. Elowen continued, her voice steady as a heartbeat. That man was my father. And the evidence he gathered, the evidence that was supposed to have been destroyed when his life was, survived. She produced the envelope the Duchess Dowager had given her and placed it on the magistrate's bench. Inside this envelope is my father's complete investigation into the fraudulent manipulation of land records, tenant rents, and estate revenues across this county. It names names, cites specific transactions, and provides documentary proof that the scheme was orchestrated by one family. She turned to face the courtroom, and her eyes found Aldrich Voss, the Voss family. The eruption was immediate. Voices rose like a tide, chairs scraped against stone, and Aldrich Voss was on his feet with a face the colour of old brick. Seraphina's composure shattered like dropped crystal, her serene expression replaced by something feral and desperate. "This is outrageous, Aldrich." "Is," bellowed. Fabricated slander from a disgraced family. The magistrate banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, and into the chaos Eloan's voice cut like a blade through cloth. "Every document in that envelope," she said, raising her voice just enough to be heard above the tumult, "corresponds to entries in the Ravensmere estate ledgers that I have personally verified over 6 months." She produced a second portfolio, thick with copied records and annotated pages. "I have traced every fraudulent transaction, identified every shell company, and documented every penny that was stolen from the Ravensmere estate and diverted into accounts controlled by Lord Aldrich Voss." She laid the portfolio beside the envelope. "Furthermore, I have recovered correspondence between Lord Voss and the Ravensmere estate steward, Mr. Hargrove, written in Lord Voss's own hand, describing the embezzlement scheme in detail. The letters were found concealed in Mr. Hargrove's desk and authenticated by 2 independent handwriting experts." She paused, letting the silence rebuild itself around her words. "As for the petition against me, every piece of evidence it contains is fabricated. The forged letters use my current handwriting, not my handwriting at the age I was supposedly writing them. The witness who testified against me was dismissed from Ravensmere 3 years before I arrived. The foreign bank account cited in the petition is registered at an institution that did not exist until 2 years after my father's death." She turned to face the magistrate, and in the grey light of the December courtroom, with every eye in the county upon her, Eloan Ashford Thornwald, Duchess of Ravensmere, looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had been underestimated by everyone, who had been dismissed and mocked and laughed at, who had lost her father and her fortune and her place in the world, and who had rebuilt herself out of silence and numbers and an unshakable commitment to the truth. "Sir Howard," she said, "I am not here to defend myself. I am here to finish what my father started." The magistrate studied the documents before him for a long moment, his expression shifting from the cautious neutrality of a political survivor to something more complex. He looked at Aldrich Voss, who was gripping the rail before him with white-knuckled hands, and then at Seraphina, whose face had gone the colour of ash. "This court will recess for 1 hour," Sir Howard announced, "during which time I will review the evidence presented by both parties." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "Lord Voss, Lady Voss, you will remain in the building." Eloan returned to her seat. Caspian's hand found hers under the table, and she held it like an anchor in a storm she had been weathering for 3 years. The hour of recess stretched like a held breath across the county courthouse. Eloan sat in a small anteroom with Caspian, the Duchess, Dowager, and her mother, who had travelled from Whitmore Cross that morning, and sat now with her hands folded in her lap, her sewing calluses visible in the pale light. No one spoke. The silence was not empty, but full, packed with years of suppressed truth, and the terrifying hope that justice, which had failed once, might not fail again. Through the thin walls, Eloan could hear the muffled roar of conversation from the courtroom. 300 voices processing the revelations that had just detonated in their midst, like a bomb dropped into still water. The Duchess Dowager sat with her ivory cane across her knees, her obsidian eyes fixed on some middle distance, and Eloan understood that the old woman was replaying her own private timeline. The visit from Edmund Ashford, the envelope entrusted to her keeping, the 3 years of watching and waiting for the right moment. She had been Eloan's unseen ally from the beginning, and the debt was one that could never be adequately repaid. Caspian broke the silence first. He turned to Eloan with an expression she had never seen on his face, one that had stripped away every layer of the ducal mask until nothing remained but the man underneath. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Not now," Eloan replied, her voice tight. "After." "No." His hand found hers again, and the urgency in his grip made her look at him properly. "Now. Because if I wait, I will find a reason to build another wall, and I am tired of walls." "Eloan." The Duchess Dowager raised one eyebrow but said nothing. Mirren Ashford studied her hands with the tactful attention of a woman who understood when to make herself invisible. Caspian spoke as though the words had been stored under pressure and the valve had finally opened. "I have spent 6 months watching you work, watching you fight for people who have no power and defend truth when lies were easier. Watching you carry the weight of your father's legacy and your mother's hope, and an entire estate's welfare on shoulders that never tremble where anyone can see." He paused, his jaw working against something. "I told you, I could not offer my heart." Eloan's breath caught. "I was wrong," Caspian said. "I could not offer it because I believed it was too damaged to have value. But you have shown me that damage does not diminish worth. Your father was destroyed, and you turned his destruction into determination. Your family lost everything, and you rebuilt from nothing. You walked into a room of people who wanted to humiliate you, and you stood there with more dignity than any of them will ever possess." He looked at her with grey eyes that had gone bright with something she had only seen once before, in the selection ball, when he had knelt beside the platform and looked at her as though she were the only person in the room. "I offer my heart now," he said. "Not because the circumstances require it, but because I cannot imagine spending another day pretending I do not love the woman who teaches me every night, through her courage and her patience and her stubborn refusal to be diminished. What it means to be truly brave." The anteroom was absolutely silent. The Duchess Dowager's expression had not changed, but her hand had tightened on her cane. Mirren Ashford was openly weeping into her handkerchief. Eloan looked at Caspian Thornwald, the Duke of Ravensmere, the man she had married for security and position and the chance to clear her father's name, and she saw him, clearly, for the first time. Not the fortress, not the title, not the carefully constructed distance that had kept the world at arm's length since a woman named Eleanor had taught him that love was a weapon. She saw a man who had chosen vulnerability in the most frightening moment of her life, who had offered the one thing he had spent years protecting, not because she asked for it, but because keeping it hidden had become more painful than the risk of giving it away. "You have extraordinarily poor timing," she said. He blinked. That was not the response I anticipated. Eloan's face cracked into a smile that she could not have suppressed if the fate of the entire county depended on it. "I love you too, you impossible man. I have loved you since the night you sat down in my study at midnight and said, 'Show me what you have found.' And I was planning to tell you after we won this hearing, in a setting with considerably less pressure." The Duchess Dowager made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was difficult to tell. A knock at the door shattered the moment. A court clerk appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "The magistrate is ready to reconvene." They filed back into the courtroom, and Eloan took her place with Caspian's hand at the small of her back. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the fabric of her grey dress, and it steadied her in a way she had not known she needed. Sir Howard Crane returned to the bench with the demeanour of a man who had spent the last hour making the most consequential decision of his career. His face was grave. The courtroom fell silent with the abrupt totality of 300 people holding their breath. "The evidence presented by the Duchess of Ravensmere," Sir Howard began, "is comprehensive, well documented, and corroborated by independent verification." A rustle moved through the crowd. "Having reviewed the materials in detail, this court finds that the petition against the Duchess is without merit and is hereby dismissed." Furthermore, the counter-evidence presented regarding the financial activities of Lord Aldrich Voss and the Ravensmere estate steward Mr. Hargrove constitutes grounds for a full criminal investigation. The courtroom erupted, but Sir Howard was not finished. He turned to face Aldrich Voss with an expression that had shed every trace of political calculation and replaced it with the cold authority of the law. "Lord Voss," he said, "you will surrender your passport and remain within this jurisdiction, pending a formal inquiry into charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Lady Seraphina Voss, you are named as a material witness and are required to make yourself available for questioning." Aldrich Voss rose to his feet, his face mottled with fury. "This is a travesty," he spat. "A conspiracy orchestrated by that woman and the Thornwald family to seize control of the county." Sir Howard's gavel struck the bench with the finality of a door slamming shut. "You are in contempt, Lord Voss. Another outburst, and you will be removed." Seraphina sat perfectly still beside her father, her face the colour of old parchment, and Eloan watched something die behind her eyes. Not the ambition or the cunning. Those would survive. But the certainty, the unshakable belief that the world would arrange itself according to her wishes, that was gone, and in its place was the unfamiliar landscape of consequence. Eloan and Caspian walked out of the courthouse into pale December sunshine. The crowd parted before them, but this time the whispers were different. Not mocking, not dismissive. Awed. The quiet Duchess, the invisible bride, the girl in the dove-grey dress had just dismantled the most powerful family in the county with nothing but a dead man's evidence and her own relentless pursuit of truth. At the foot of the courthouse steps, the tenants of the Ravensmere estate had gathered. Farmers and their wives, blacksmiths and millers, the people who had been quietly robbed for 5 years by men who considered them beneath notice. They stood in a loose half-circle, and as Eloan descended the steps, one of them began to clap. Then another. Then another. The sound built like gathering rain until it echoed off the stone buildings and filled the square with a thunder that had nothing to do with weather. Eloan stopped on the bottom step and looked at the faces before her, faces weathered by work and wind, faces she had come to know through 6 months of careful study. And she felt her father's presence beside her, like sunlight breaking through cloud. She had finished what he started. The letter had finally been delivered. Caspian's arms slid around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the quiet completeness of someone who had finally stopped carrying the weight alone. Seraphina Voss burned the evidence on a Thursday night, 3 days after the courthouse hearing, in the fireplace of her father's study while the household slept. She fed the papers one by one into the flames, watching the ink curl and blacken, and she did not stop until every document that connected the Voss family to a decade of corruption was nothing but grey ash and the smell of scorched truth. She had expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt the particular emptiness of a woman who had just destroyed the last bridge between herself and the life she had planned. Her father was under house arrest, confined to the estate pending the formal inquiry. His allies had evaporated overnight. Political friendships dissolving at the first hint of personal risk, like sugar in hot water. The county families, who had been eager to align themselves with the Voss name, now treated it like a disease. And Seraphina found herself, for the first time in her life, utterly and completely alone. She sat in the ashes of her own making and understood, with a clarity that was almost surgical, that she had 2 choices. She could fight, which would mean more lies, more fabrication, more desperate manoeuvring that would ultimately fail because Eloan Ashford had copies of everything Seraphina had just burned. Or she could do the one thing that terrified her more than any courtroom. She could tell the truth. The decision was not noble. It was strategic, the calculation of a woman who understood that when every other weapon had failed, honesty was the last resort of the defeated. But as Seraphina sat in her father's study with ash on her fingers and the taste of failure in her mouth, something unexpected stirred beneath the strategy. A memory she had suppressed for so long, it felt like discovering a room in a house she thought she knew completely. She was 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in the cottage where the family had lived before her father's first success, watching her mother press wildflowers between the pages of a book. Her mother had been different then, softer, gentler, before the wealth and the ambition had remade them all into instruments of her father's vision. Serafina, her mother had said, arranging a daisy between sheets of tissue paper, you do not need to be the most powerful person in the room to be the most important one. She had forgotten that woman. She had forgotten that version of herself, the girl who collected wildflowers and believed in kindness. The fire had consumed the last of the documents, and the study was cold. The next morning, Serafina Voss walked into the offices of Sir Howard Crane and surrendered. She provided a full and detailed testimony of every fraudulent act her family had committed over 15 years, including the destruction of Edmund Ashford, the embezzlement from Ravensmere, the fabrication of evidence against Ilawan, and the network of intimidation and bribery that had kept the county's institutions compliant. Her testimony took 8 hours. When it was finished, Sir Howard looked at her across his desk, with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been respect for the sheer magnitude of what she had just confessed. She was offered a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, and she accepted it with the composed efficiency she brought to everything. On her way out of the building, she passed Elowen Ashford on the steps. The two women looked at each other for a long moment, and something passed between them that was too complicated for simple words. Not forgiveness, because forgiveness would take years if it came at all. Not understanding, because how could you understand the person who had tried to destroy you? But recognition. The recognition of two women who had been shaped by the same corrupt system, one into a weapon and the other into a shield, and who had both, in their different ways, survived it. Aldrich Voss did not go quietly when the constables arrived at the Voss estate to execute the arrest warrant. They found the house empty and the stable cleared of horses. Aldrich had fled in the night, taking with him what remained of the family's liquid assets, and leaving behind a wife who had not been informed of his departure. The search lasted 2 weeks and ended at a port town on the southern coast, where Aldrich was discovered attempting to board a merchant vessel bound for the continent with a false passport and a trunk containing £40,000 in gold certificates. His arrest was reported in every newspaper in the county, and the trial that followed became the most discussed legal proceeding in a generation. The evidence was overwhelming. Ilawan's documentation, combined with Serafina's testimony and Edmund Ashford's posthumous investigation, created a picture of systematic corruption so detailed that the defence could offer no meaningful rebuttal. Aldrich Voss was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Mr. Hargrove, the estate steward, received 8 years. 3 other accomplices received lesser sentences. And Edmund Ashford, 3 years after his death, was officially exonerated. The news of her father's exoneration reached Elowen on a Sunday morning, which she found appropriate because Sundays had always belonged to Edmund. She was standing at his grave on the hill above Whitmore Cross, the winter wind pulling at her coat, when Caspian appeared at her side carrying a newspaper. He did not speak. He simply held it out so she could read the headline, and then he stood beside her while she read it twice, 3 times, 4 times, until the words stopped swimming and solidified into the reality she had spent 3 years fighting for. Edmund Ashford, magistrate of Whitmore Cross, exonerated of all charges. Her hands shook so badly the paper rattled in the wind. She folded it carefully, tucked it inside her coat, and placed her palm flat against the cold stone of her father's grave marker. "It's done," she whispered. You were right about everything, Papa. You were right, and they knew you were right, and that is why they tried to destroy you. But you planned for it. You trusted me to finish it. And I did. She pressed her forehead against the stone and closed her eyes, and the tears that came were not the tears of grief she had carried for 3 years, but the tears of a burden finally set down. Caspian waited. He did not touch her, did not speak, did not try to rush or redirect her grief. He simply stood beside her in the winter wind and let her feel what she needed to feel for as long as she needed to feel it. When she finally straightened and turned to him, her eyes were red, but her expression was clear. The peace in it was something new, something that had not been there before, as though a knot that had been tightened in her chest since she was 21 had finally, irrevocably loosened. "Take me home," she said. He offered his arm, and she took it. They walked down the hill together, past the church, and through the village of Whitmore Cross, where the people who had once looked away from the disgraced magistrate's daughter now nodded with genuine respect. The cottage on Briarsfield Lane was visible in the distance, its chimney trailing smoke, and Eloan knew her mother was inside, probably already crying over the news. But home was not the cottage anymore. Home was the man walking beside her, whose walls had come down stone by stone over 6 months of midnight conversations and shared purpose, and whose heart, once offered, had proven to be exactly the shelter she had been searching for without knowing it. That evening, Elawan and Caspian sat together in the east wing study that had become their shared space. The fire crackled in the grate, casting warm light across the desk where they had spent so many late nights building their case. The ledgers were closed now, the documents filed, the evidence delivered. The desk held instead 2 cups of coffee, dark with honey, and between them a small leather notebook, worn soft with use. It was the notebook Eloan had kept since the beginning, the one she had hidden in the lining of her coat, and it contained every piece of evidence she had gathered, every suspicion she had confirmed, every step of the journey from Invisible Girl to Duchess of Ravensmere. She pushed it across the desk toward Caspian. He opened it and read the first entry, dated 3 years before, written in the careful hand of a young woman who had just buried her father. "Today I begin," the entry read. "I do not know where this will end. I only know that the truth survived, because Papa made sure it would, and I will carry it until someone listens." Caspian looked up from the notebook, and his eyes held the brightness of a man who had discovered that love, real love, was not the consuming fire of poetry, but the steady warmth of a candle in a dark room, small and persistent, and utterly impossible to extinguish. "Someone listened," he said quietly. Spring came to Ravensmere, the way spring comes to places that have survived a hard winter, slowly at first, and then all at once, flooding the grounds with green and gold until the memory of frost seemed impossible. Elawan stood at the window of the east wing study on a March morning, watching the gardens come alive beneath a sky the colour of washed silk, and pressed her hand against the gentle swell of her stomach. The child was due in September, and the knowledge of it sat inside her like a second heartbeat, small and fierce, and full of a future she had not dared to imagine 12 months ago. Caspian had received the news with an expression of such unguarded wonder that Elawan had laughed aloud, possibly the first time she had laughed with genuine abandon since before her father's death. He had stood in this very room, holding the physician's letter in both hands, and looked at her as though she had handed him the keys to a country he thought had been permanently closed. Then he had crossed the room in 2 strides, gathered her against him, and pressed his face into her hair, and she had felt him trembling. This man who faced courtrooms and county assemblies without flinching, trembling against her because the prospect of fatherhood had cracked him open in a way that nothing else ever had. The estate was transforming around them. With Hargrove gone and the embezzlement scheme dismantled, Elawin had worked with Caspian to install a new steward, a young man named Thomas Birch, who had been recommended by the tenants themselves. The stolen funds were being recovered through legal proceedings, and every penny returned was reinvested in the estate. Roofs were repaired. Drainage ditches were dug. A new school was built in Whitmore Cross, funded entirely by the Ravensmere estate, and Allowin taught there twice a week because some habits were too important to abandon simply because your circumstances had changed. The tenant farmers who had been overcharged had their rents adjusted retroactively, and 3 families who had been forced from their homes by the inflated costs were invited to return. Caspian walked the grounds every morning now, something he had never done before Eloan, learning the names of the people who worked his land, understanding the drainage patterns and crop rotations and the 100 small details that separated a thriving estate from a declining one. He carried a notebook of his own, smaller than Eloan's, in which he recorded everything he learned, and she sometimes caught him studying it at his desk with the concentrated expression of a student, determined not to fail. The Duchess Dowager observed these changes from her usual position in the drawing room, her obsidian eyes missing nothing, her ivory cane resting across her knees like a sceptre. She said little, but her silence was eloquent, carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who had played a very long game and won. One afternoon she called Eloan to her side and pressed something into her hand. It was a cameo brooch, carved from shell, depicting a woman's profile in silhouette. "It belonged to the first Duchess of Ravensmere," the old woman said. "A woman who came to this house with nothing but her intelligence and her conviction, and who built everything you see from the ground up." Eloan turned the brooch in her fingers, feeling the weight of history in its delicate carving. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you are her heir in the only way that matters," the Duchess Dowager said, "not by blood, but by character." She paused, her expression softening by a fraction of a degree. "I chose well when I wrote to your mother. But you chose better when you decided to walk through that door and not look back." Eloan pinned the brooch to her collar and felt it settle against her chest like a small ancient heartbeat, joining the 2 she already carried. On a warm evening in April, Ravensmere Hall hosted its first formal gathering since the selection ball. The occasion was the official celebration of the estate's restoration, a dinner and dance attended by every family in the county and several from neighbouring regions. The great ballroom was lit with the same crystal chandeliers that had thrown fractured light across Eloan's dove-grey dress a year before, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. The guests who arrived were not calculating alliances or positioning themselves for advantage. They came because they had watched a quiet woman transform an estate, clear her father's name, and expose corruption that had poisoned their community for 15 years, and they wanted to stand in the same room with her. Eloan dressed for the evening in a gown of deep blue silk, the colour of twilight over Ravensmere, with the cameo brooch at her throat, and her dark hair swept up to reveal the necklace Caspian had given her. That morning, a simple pendant set with a grey pearl. "Grey," she had said, smiling. "Like steel when you look at it in the right light." The ballroom filled with music and conversation, and the warm hum of a community rebuilding itself. Eloan moved through the crowd with the quiet grace that had always been her nature, not demanding attention but receiving it anyway, because people who have witnessed someone's courage cannot look away from them easily. She spoke with tenant farmers and their wives, with county officials who had once ignored her, with women who had whispered behind fans and now greeted her with genuine warmth. She accepted their respect with the same composure she had shown their contempt, because Eloan Ashford Thornwald had long ago learned that other people's opinions were weather, changeable and beyond her control, and that the only approval worth seeking was the kind that came from living honestly. In a corner of the ballroom she noticed a face she had not expected. Serafina Voss stood near the doorway, dressed simply in grey, her expression uncertain and stripped of every weapon she had once carried. She had completed her testimony. Her legal obligations were fulfilled. She had no reason to be here except one, and Eloan recognized it because she had felt it herself. Eloan crossed the room and stood before the woman who had tried to destroy her. Up close, Serafina looked smaller than she had in the courtroom, diminished not by defeat, but by the absence of the armor she had worn for so long. Her eyes held a question she did not know how to ask. Eloan answered it anyway. "You came," she said. Serafina nodded, her composure fragile as spun glass. "I did not know if I would be welcome." "You are not forgiven," Eloan said simply. The words were not cruel. They were honest, and honesty was the currency Eloan dealt in. "But you are not excluded. There is a difference." Serafina's eyes glistened. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then spoke with a voice that had shed every trace of the polished confidence that had once been her defining characteristic. "I burned the documents," she said. "The ones from my father's study. And then I surrendered because I remembered something my mother told me when I was a child. And I realized that I had spent my entire life forgetting it." Eloan waited. Serafina's next words were barely a whisper. She told me I did not need to be the most powerful person in the room to be the most important one. Eloan studied her for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She extended her hand. It was not an embrace. It was not warmth. It was a handshake, firm and deliberate, between two women who would never be friends, but who had reached an understanding that transcended friendship. Serafina took it, and something in her expression settled, not into peace, but into the beginning of a road that might, with enough time and enough honesty, lead there eventually. Across the ballroom, Caspian watched his wife with the expression he had worn since the night he had first spoken her name in front of 300 people. The expression of a man who had been looking at the wrong things his entire life and had finally turned his gaze in the right direction. The music swelled, and he crossed the floor to where Eloan stood. He offered his hand. "Dance with me," he said. It was not a question, but it was not a command either. It was an invitation from a man who had once believed that walls were the only architecture worth building, to the woman who had taught him that the strongest structures are built not from stone, but from trust and truth and the stubborn refusal to be invisible. Eloan took his hand. They stepped onto the dance floor together, and 300 people watched the Duke of Ravensmere and his quiet Duchess move through the candlelight with the easy certainty of two people who had found each other against every expectation. The chandeliers threw fractured light across the ballroom. The music carried into the gardens. And somewhere on a hill above Whitmore Cross, the wind moved across a gravestone marked with a simple name. And the grass around it grew green and new, as though the earth itself was finally, at last, at peace.